After studying this module, you would be able to know about the humanistic perspective on self, learn how humanistic perspective views human behavior, identify how humanistic approach has evolved, evaluate the contributions of different theorists towards the humanistic approach, analyze the basic assumptions underlying the humanistic approach, methodology used by the humanistic perspective, and evaluate the strengths and limitations of humanistic perspective. Let me first introduce to this humanistic perspective. Since its inception, the humanistic approach of psychology has stressed upon the pursuit of a philosophical and scientific considerate of human existence that focuses on the human accomplishment and potential. For humanistic psychologists, the most important aspect has been to understand the concept of how an individual can reach one's full potential and become a fully functioning being. These psychologists have tried to come up with techniques and have tried to discover pathways that contribute to human beings to achieve full humanness. Humanistic psychologists criticized the conventional psychological schools of thoughts for stating a weakened model of human nature. Their efforts for an optimistic model and enriched concept of humanity provided much of the motivation for the early thriving of humanity, provided much of the motivation for early thriving of humanistic psychology. The terminologies humanistic, humanism and humanist in psychology relates to an approach which emphasizes on the holistic view of the person and also considers each individual to be unique. For all intents and purposes, these terms refer to the same approach in psychology. Humanism is a psychological approach that stresses the study of the whole person. Humanistic psychologists view human behavior not only through the eyes of the observer, but through the eyes of the person doing the behaving. Humanistic psychologists believe that an individual's behavior is interrelated to their inner feelings and self-concept. The humanistic approach in psychology established as an insurgence in contrast to what some psychologists saw as limitations of the behaviorist and psychodynamic psychology. The humanistic approach is thus often called as the third force in psychology, after psychoanalysis being the first and behaviorism being the second one.
Despite the fact that the first half of the 20th century was led by two prominent schools of thoughts, namely psychoanalysis and behaviorism, a new school of thought known as humanistic psychology developed in the course of the second half of the century. Time and again stated as the third force in psychology, this theoretical perspective accumulated conscious experiences. It is both a reaction to and an extension of the other two schools. It is both an abstract entity and a practical guide for living. Humanistic psychologists had an optimistic view of human beings and believed in their goodness. According to them, humans are not merely the products of their environment, rather, humanistic psychologists study human meanings, understandings, and experiences involved in growing, teaching, and learning. They highlighted certain features that are shared by all human beings, such as love, grief, caring, and self worth. This perspective focused on the study of the whole person. The concepts of humanism started in ancient Greek period. The humanistic psychologist needed to form a force in psychology and to go beyond the errors made by other two forces. For the first half of the 20th century, American psychology was controlled by two schools of thought, behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Neither fully recognized the probability of studying values, intentions, and meanings as elements in conscious existence. The years 1954 to 1973 are considered as the fundamental years of humanistic psychology. During these years, humanistic psychology was at the forefront. In the year 1973, Mizak and Sentox wrote their systematic academic book describing humanistic psychology as a complete movement. Of immediate prominence for their critical role in promoting the key concept and descriptions of the humanistic perspective are two European, Kurt Goldstein, who was a German, and Andres Angel. Origin of humanistic psychology dates back to the era of the post-World War II, where an eclectic approach was undertaken between behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and cognitive psychologists, etc., was perceived in the past before the humanistic psychology came into being. Primary notion of humanism occurred previously in ancient Greece throughout the Renaissance and in Christianity. In US, humanistic psychology as a movement grew as a matter of concern for human individualism. The Principles of Psychology was written by William James, where he penned about the concern about life's problems. Other self theories came from George Herbert Mead in his book Mind, Self, and Society. The third force movement became very popular in the 1960s and 70s, but its acceptance fell in the 1980s and continues to do so. But it remains persuasive in some parts of the present day psychology, just like behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Snakes and Combs. The field of phenomenology in the year 1949 grew out of the work of Snakes and Combs. According to them, phenomenology refers to the conviction that a person will act in a way consistent with his or her perceptual field. To put it in other words, realism is not innate in the experience but in the individual's perception of the event. Humanistic psychologists completely agree with this phenomenological belief because they endeavor to take into account a person's perception of an event while studying human behavior. Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow, an American psychologist, is considered as one of the prominent figures and founding father associated with humanistic psychology. He was the one who built this third force as he had an optimistic view of human beings and focused on human potential rather than in pointing out human deficiencies. He condemned the psychologists of his time for studying mentally ill and maladjusted humans rather than those who are superior and healthy. He preferred a more positive approach towards psychology. He believed that each individual has an innate capacity to strive towards self actualization. His theory of the self and of self actualization served as a foundation for later humanistic psychologists. Maslow's effort has facilitated in the understanding of motivation and self actualization, which is now being applied in various fields to enhance the overall potential of an individual, for example, in the area of education, counseling, organization, defense, politics, etc. In the course of the early 1960s, Maslow, along with colleagues such as Anthony Switch, initiated the transpersonal psychology movement, a subdivision of humanistic psychology dedicated to the study of humans' highest potential. Morris, another theorist who contributed and extended the humanistic psychology, was Morris. He alleged that human beings are competent enough to think about their thought processes in an analytical manner by evaluating them and correcting it. He emphasized that people can think about their frame of mind and is not conscious but self conscious. According to him, with self awareness, individuals can enhance themselves and reach their full potential. Rogers. Carl Rogers, like Maslow, also purported in an inherent human drive towards self actualization. He further added that for a person to grow, they require an environment that offers them with genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. Rogers' main contribution to the field of psychology is his client centered approach to therapy. And also, he made his influence on humanistic psychology in its application to education. He developed an educational philosophy that emphasizes the importance of forming personal meanings during the learning process. In addition, he focused on self, unconditional positive regard, and full functioning being. James B. Gentle. In the early development of humanistic psychology, James B. Gentle has contributed significantly in the practice of a humanistic approach to psychotherapy. Gentle adopts an existential perspective, accepting the person in terms of intentionality rather than causality, and subjectivity rather than drive theory. He saw psychotherapy as a struggle, the success of which ultimately depends on the client's willingness to risk reconnecting with his or her inner sensing. Rolome. Rolome, the eminent existential psychologist and existential psychotherapist, was a co founder of the humanistic psychology movement. He was a forthright critic of his contemporaries and was chiefly responsible for assimilating the humanistic and existential traditions. He claimed that human nature can only be understood by concentrating on the individual's subjective experience and stressed that the authentic self was only experienced when we assert ourselves, take a stand against what we find undesirable. He highlighted the central role of freedom, choice, and responsibility in human existence. The basic ideas behind humanistic psychology are simple. They hold the following beliefs. Behavior must be understood in terms of the subjective experience of the individual. If you wish to understand behavior, one should include how the person sees the world. The present is the most significant part of the person, and humanistic focuses on the here and now rather than looking at the past or trying to predict the future. Humanistic theory focuses on the goodness of humankind. According to them, actions of people may not always be positive, but this does not mean that individuals are not good. Humanistic theory is reality based, and to be psychologically healthy, people take responsibility for themselves, whether the person's actions are positive or negative. The goal of life should always be to achieve personal growth and understanding. Each person is unique, and his problems must be resolved in terms of his own subjective conscious worldview. Studying individual is more informative than studying what groups of individuals have in common. Research should seek to find those things that will help solve human problems. Humanistic psychologists study the mechanisms of human thought. They focus on the structure and organization of what a person knows and how his thoughts, beliefs, expectations, and interpretations affect behavior. Humanistic psychologists believe the concept of the self held by an individual influences their behavior and is related to their emotional state, well being, and judgment. Methodological approaches. Humanistic psychology does not easily lend itself to lab research, that is, objective experimentation is impossible. Humanistic psychologists are not scientists in the traditional sense, and they don't want to be because they think that science in the present form is not equipped to study, explain, or understand human nature. A new science is needed, a human science is needed. A human science would not study humans as the physical sciences study physical objects, but rather study humans as aware, choosing, valuing, emotional, and unique beings in the universe. Since traditional science does not do this, it must be rejected. Humanistic approach favors a qualitative approach to data collection. Humanism rejects scientific methodology like experiments and typically uses qualitative research methods. For example, diary accounts, open ended questionnaires, unstructured interviews, and unstructured observations. Qualitative research is useful for studies at the individual level and to find out in depth the ways in which people think or feel. Where observations is used, it is likely to be participant observation, with the researcher taking part in what they are studying in order to understand how the participants perceive it. Humanistic psychologists may also analyze all sorts of qualitative materials that allow them insight into how people understand their world, including diaries, letters, and biographies. An example of this type of research is Maslow's analysis of the characteristics of self actualizers. Weaknesses. The criticism have centered on the difficulty of verifying the basic assumptions of the approach, as well as on the question whether unconditional positive regard does in fact lead to greater personality adjustment. Humanistic approach have also been criticized for assuming that people are basically good, a notion that is unverifiable and equally important for using non-scientific values to build supposedly scientific theories. Humanistic psychologists deliberately adopt a non scientific approach to studying humans. For example, their belief in free will is in direct opposition to the deterministic laws of science. Strengths. Still, humanistic theories have been important in highlighting the uniqueness of human beings and in guiding the development of a significant form of therapy designed to alleviate psychological difficulties. Humanism can gain a better insight into an individual's behavior through the use of qualitative methods such as unstructured interviews. The approach also helped to prove a more holistic view of human behavior in contrast to the reductionist position of science. On the other hand, the counseling approaches developed by Rogers and other humanists have helped many people overcome difficulties they face in life, which is a significant contribution to improving people's lives.
Now, friends, let us summarize. The humanistic approach is thus often called as the third force in psychology, after psychoanalysis being the first and behaviorism being the second one. Humanistic psychologists had an optimistic view of human beings and believed in their goodness. That is the first thing that we learned in this chapter. The origins of humanistic psychology can be traced back as far as the Middle Ages, when the philosophy of humanism was born. Modern humanistic psychology emerged in the mid 1950s, reaction to the schools of behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychology developed into a vital field of psychology during the second half of the 20th century. The founding theorists behind this school of thought are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers chiefly. The basic assumptions of the humanistic approach are that behavior must be understood in terms of the subjective experience of the individual and that behavior is not guarded by either past experience of the individual or current circumstances. Humanism rejects the scientific methodologies like experiments and typically uses qualitative research methods. Qualitative research is useful for studies at the individual level to find out in depth the ways in which people think or feel, example, the case study method. Humanistic psychology has contributed in the areas such as therapy, abnormality, motivation and personality.